So now that we got started with the Riverpod package and we built our first provider, it's time for a second provider, which I'll store in a new file to keep things organized and separated. And this will be my favorites provider, which I want to store in this file, hence I'll name the file favorites provider. And the idea here is to build a provider that simply stores all these favorite meals in a list of favorite meals. For this, in this favorites provider Dart file, we of course need to import the Flutter Riverpod package and the Flutter Riverpod.dart file from that package. And we also need to create a new variable, the favorite meals provider variable, for example, that stores a provider. However, this time we're not going to create the provider like this, because this basic provider class here is great if you have static dummy data like here, a list that never changes. If you have more complex data that should change under certain circumstances, the provider class is the wrong choice. In that case, you should instead use the StateNotifier provider class, which is another provider class provided by Riverpod that is optimized for data that can change. Now, this StateNotifier provider class works together with another class, just as stateful widgets work together with state objects, you could say. And that other class with which the StateNotifier provider works together is the StateNotifier class, which is also provided by Riverpod. Now, this class is actually not instantiated like this though. Instead, you use this class to build your own class that extends this class. Now, your own class can technically have any name you want, but the convention is to end the name with notifier, and I'll therefore name my class favorite meals notifier like this and extend StateNotifier. Now, StateNotifier is actually a generic class, just as the built-in state class, which is provided by Flutter, is generic. And here I'll therefore add angle brackets to in the end tell Flutter Riverpod which kind of data will be managed by this notifier and therefore ultimately by this provider, you could say. And the data I plan on managing here will be a list of meals. Now, for a meal to be available, we must make sure that we add an import to the meal.dart file from the models folder. And now with that, we can fill this class with some life. And the life I do want to add to this class is A, the initial value. So in this case, for example, initially an empty list of meals. And B, all the methods that should exist to change that value, to change that list in this case. Now, the initial data is set up by adding a constructor function, which, as you learned, has the same name as the class. And then here we don't pass anything to this constructor function, or we don't expect any parameters to be precise. Instead, we add such an initializer list by adding a colon after the constructor function parameter list. And then here we call super to reach out to the parent class, so to the StateNotifier. And to super, we pass our initial data. Now, that data can be of any shape of your choice. It can be a list, it can be a map, it can be another object based on another class, it can be a string, but of course it should be of that type that you define here between the angle brackets. So here it should be a list of meals. And therefore here I'll pass such a list, though at the beginning it will just be an empty list. With that, we set the initial data that will be stored in this notifier and therefore ultimately also soon in this provider. Next, we also add any methods we want to this class that allow us to edit this data. And here this will just be one method, which I'll call toggle meal favorite status, though the name is up to you, which expects to get a meal of type meal as an input, and which then should add that meal to that list if it's not a favorite yet, and remove it otherwise. Now, for that, you could think that you simply use the logic we used before in the tabs widget. There we also got a meal, and then we simply checked if it was already part of the favorites, and if it was, we removed it with the remove method, and otherwise we added it with the add method. This will not work here anymore, because one important thing you must keep in mind related to that value that's managed by this notifier is that you must never edit that value. And you might recall from earlier in the course that in the end, when you create objects, those objects are stored in memory, and they can be replaced with new objects which have a new address in memory, in which case the old object, if it's not used anywhere else, would get deleted. But you can also edit an existing object in memory so that the address stays the same, and you manipulate that existing object in memory instead of replacing it or instead of adding a new one. And this approach is not allowed when using StateNotifier. You're not allowed to edit an existing value in memory. Instead, you must always create a new one. That's simply a pattern enforced by this package. Therefore, we're not allowed to reach out to this list and call add or remove as we did before. This would not be allowed. Instead, we have to replace it. Now, to replace it, there is this globally available state property. This property is made available by the StateNotifier class. Now, this state property holds your data, so in this case, a list of meals. And again, calling add or remove on that would not be allowed. Instead, you have to reassign it by using the assignment operator to a new list. So a new list, no matter if you're adding a meal or removing a meal. Therefore, what we have to do here is we first of all have to find out whether a meal is part of that list or not. And then thereafter, we have to create a new list based on that information. Now for that, we can of course again use state contains meal though, because that will not edit the state, it will just look into the state, and that of course is allowed. And this will tell us whether a meal is a favorite or not. So that's how we get this information. But then if a meal is a favorite, we'll have to remove it from that list without using the remove method. And this can be achieved by setting state equal to state where. Because remember, with where we filter a list and we get a new list. Or a new iterable, which we can convert to a list by calling toList. So where gives us a new list, and that's of course exactly what we need here, a new list. So where then gets a function where we get the current list items, item after item, and we have to return true to keep it or false to drop it. And here I want to keep a meal if its ID is not equal to the ID of the meal I'm getting here. Now here I would have a name clash effectively because I have a bunch of meals here. So to set those meals apart, I'll name my meal here just M. And now this meal refers to the meal I'm getting here as an argument. So now if the IDs are not equal, I know that the meal I'm taking a look at is not the meal I'm toggling the favorite status for, and therefore I definitely want to keep that meal. That's why I'm checking for inequality, because I want to get true if the IDs do not match, because on the other hand, if they do match, I know that this is the meal that should be removed, and therefore I want to get false as a response to drop it. That's what I'm doing here. So that's how I can remove a meal. For adding a meal, I can use a different syntax and set my state equal to a new list where I simply want to keep all the existing items, but then also add a new one. And to do this, we can use the spread operator, which you also saw earlier in the course already. You can use it on a list, so in this case on state, which is a list of meals, to pull out all the elements that are stored in that list and add them as individual elements to this new list. And then separated by a comma, we can add yet another new element, and that would be this meal here. So that we pull out and keep all the existing meals and add them to a new list. And we also add the new meal to that list. That's what we're doing here. And with that, we're updating this state in a immutable way. So without mutating, without editing the existing state in memory. And that was a lot of talking about this, but it is important to understand how we do store and access and update this state when using Riverpod's StateNotifier here. So with that, we finished this favorite meals notifier class, which has initial data and a method to edit this data. Now we just need to connect it to this actual provider so that we can use this data in our widgets. Now to connect this, we have to go to StateNotifier provider here. And to StateNotifier provider, we still pass a function where we still get a ref that does not change compared to the meals provider. And in this function here, I now still want to return a value, so that also doesn't change. But the value which I do provide here is now an instance of this notifier. So we use this class name, favorite meals notifier, and instantiate this. And now this provider returns an instance of our notifier class so that we have this class for editing the state and for retrieving the state. Now here we should also do one more thing. StateNotifier provider is a generic type, and it does understand that it returns a favorite meals notifier, but it does not understand, unfortunately, which data this favorite meals notifier will yield in the end. Therefore, here we should add angle brackets and add two generic type definitions here. The first one is favorite meals notifier, but the second one then is the data that will be yielded by the favorite meals notifier in the end. And here that will be a list of meals. So we should add this to get better type support in the rest of our application. Well, and with that, finally, this favorite meals notifier is set up. This is how we would do it if we would be using Riverpod for this. And now we can use it in our widgets. We can use it to get our list of favorites, but then also to trigger this method and change our favorites.